Yes.
So, dear colleagues, welcome today to the second workshop on the challenging abortion issues which have attracted attention around the globe at the time, and the Journal of Population Economics is proud to have been made a number of contributions exactly at this time, and this brought us to the idea that we should share our findings, the research findings, with those interested and give a chance to readers to interact with the authors. The whole issue is the session is recorded and will be visible at the GLO website tomorrow also. Now I'm just the person who welcomes everybody. I handle over to the boss of the session, Madeline Zawodny, who will share and direct. Madeline, please.
All right, thank you. So we are delighted to have two forthcoming papers in the Journal of Population Economics today, both about U.S. abortion policy. And so first we will have Knowles Myers, and then we will have Grace Arnold. Each of them will have 20 minutes, and each paper is going to be followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A with all of you. So I will call on people during that Q&A. You will hopefully then unmute yourself, the thing we all forget to do, to ask your question, and then they will respond. But with that, I will let Caitlin take it away.
Awesome, thanks so much. Let me share my screen. All right, I hope y'all are getting a view of slides. Is that, yep, good, excellent. So this is going to be a really unusual presentation for me as an applied microeconomist, and maybe for y'all too. In fact, this is the first and only paper I have ever written that has 0 regressions in it, and really doesn't have like an empirical analysis component. I also hope and think it's actually a really useful paper for empirical social scientists and for people here who do run regressions, which, you know, I do too, and conduct econometric analyses. And perhaps also it's a bit of an object lesson on how difficult and important it is to get the policy variation right when we're using it as a natural experiment. So in this paper, it just came out in the Journal of Population Economics, as Klaus was saying. And in this paper, I'm really revisiting the policy variation that is a foundation for a large and influential literature in economics. And that literature pretty much starts with Golden and Katz's 2002 Power of the Pill paper in the JPE, where they used variation in legal and confidential access to the pill to estimate the effect of pill access on women's career and marriage decisions. And that was followed up by Martha Bailey in 2006 with a paper in the QJE called More Power to the Pill, which really uses a similar identification strategy, but looks at fertility, marriage, and labor force outcomes for all women as the outcomes. So I think these two seminal papers really spawned a bit of a kind of cottage industry of Power of the Pill papers, and that's fine. I mean, I've written papers like that as well, where you see a group of authors come up with a really cool research design and a really important policy question: what was the impact of the diffusion of the contraceptive pill on women's lives? And so a lot of people started to look at kind of other outcome variables. And so there's a whole series of papers, these are just some of them, that use this policy variation to look at outcomes, including educational attainment for men and women, effects on the next generation's poverty status, effects on labor force attachment, effects on professional occupations. So I initially began working on a really similar paper that would have fit squarely within this More Power to the Pill literature. And it was with an undergraduate at Middlebury College. They were just working on a senior thesis. It was about narrowing gender gaps in the 1970s. They weren't explicitly focused on the effect of reproductive policy on gender gaps, but they were aware of this literature, and they were like, oh, this should be like a control variable in my regression. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Go get the policy coding from one of the authors who's published policy coding. And at the very least, at that point, Golden and Katz, Bailey, Heinrich Koch, and Melanie Gouldy all had published somewhat independent, like different sets of policy coding in different papers. And so the student came back and said, well, I don't know which one to choose. And I said, oh, it probably shouldn't matter, right? Just look at them. There might be a couple discrepancies, track them down and stick it in your regression. And they were like, no, there's a lot of discrepancies. And so, I went and looked, and I was really dumbfounded to find out that the authors disagreed on the year young women could legally consent to the pill for 35 out of 51 states in DC. And they didn't just disagree by a little bit, they disagreed by a lot, by years in the policy coding. And it wasn't clear to me which coding should be used. It wasn't particularly well documented, honestly. And so we just had like kind of different sets of tables with different years. And I was like, oh. So the right thing to do when you're a junior, which I was at that point, so I was pre-tenure, this was not my research area at the time. The right thing to do would be to walk away and go do something easier. But I have a real obsessive streak, and I kept trying to figure out what was right. The student just, meanwhile, didn't put it in the regression, wrote a thesis, graduated, and moved on. I kept thinking about it, and like reading primary sources and trying to figure it out. And at the same time, I also started to think, well, wait a minute, what about abortion? Because in the Bailey and Golden and Katz papers, they did control for Roe v. Wade and abortion repeals and just whether abortion was legal. But what they didn't consider or discuss was that a lot of their identification strategy was resting on laws that governed whether young, unmarried women could legally consent to contraceptive services, which would provide them with what Bailey calls early legal access to the pill. And I think access is kind of vague, so I will call that confidential access to the pill, meaning you could consent to the pill without bringing a parent with you. So they were looking at these laws governing confidential access to the pill, but a lot of those same laws potentially granted confidential access to abortion when it became available. And so kind of the second question is like, how do you handle this really complex policy environment in the US in the early 70s? In fact, I'm going to zoom out. So I had this kind of picture in the sidebar. It was of a demonstration in Buffalo, New York in 1970, I think it's 1970. And it's cold, it's January, and you see this young woman marching with a sign that says birth control laws must go. And it's really that variation in laws that were the repeal and invalidation of laws restricting birth control access that's the foundation of the power of the pill literature. But if you zoom out on the demonstration, you'll see that there's women carrying all sorts of signs, and that they're also carrying signs advocating for access to abortion. And it's all happening at once. And in fact, while Golden and Katz and Bailey don't address that, Heinrich Hock and Melanie Gouldy did in two early papers. They talked about the fact that we have like a really complicated policy interplay. And they control for whether young women could consent to abortion. But again, they also disagree on 18 states in the years when young women gained that right. And so, you're really stuck if you want to, at least I felt stuck around, gosh, when did I start working on this? It was around 2008. And I felt really stuck on which set of policy coding to use. And so what I did was spend upwards of 10 years in the end, exhaustively reviewing primary sources because there was no secondary source that was providing this overview of policy variation. So what I did is really dive into the primary sources, review all of the statutes, the historical legislative statutes, any court rulings that are citing the statutes, and then all sorts of secondary sources like medical journals and newspaper coverage of the law changes to see how people were interpreting them at the time. And so the culmination of all of that work is the paper that I'm presenting today, which provides that overview for everyone else. Basically, it's kind of, I hope, my gift to the empirical world to say, like, here's the documentation of the policy coding. So I have a broad overview of all of the policy variation, begins in 1960, goes all the way to really 2021. It's up to date through 2021. Roe is about to be overturned, so it's not up to date for that. But it's up to date through 2021. It provides recommended policy coding It reviews and reconciles the previous discrepancies to say, like, why do I think people were disagreeing, who was making a mistake and why, whenever I can, and to identify the situations where maybe there is some ambiguity rather than an objective mistake, and give the researchers, like, the information you need to decide how you want to reconcile the ambiguity, or perhaps simply conduct robustness tests to see whether it matters. So there's all that detailed state-by-state information in an online appendix. And I've also published at Open Science Framework a policy data set that you can download if you want to use my policy coding or some of the kind of alternative sets of coding you might decide. So that's what's in the paper. And what I'm going to use the rest of my time for today is just to provide you a really high-level overview of what policies we're talking about. So I won't be diving into all of that detail, but let's just talk about, like, kind of in general what's going on. I'm going to start with contraceptive policies. So this paper is talking about access to contraception, and it begins in 1960 because that is the year the FDA, the United States, gosh, what does the Food and Drug Administration, approved Enovid, the first contraceptive pill, for contraceptive purposes. It was a really big deal from the get-go, widely covered, widely discussed. Within 5 years, 6.5 million married women in the US were on the pill. But it wasn't universally accessible in the United States. In those early years, whether a US woman could legally obtain the pill depended on what state she lived in, how old she was, and whether she was married. And that's the policy environment that we're talking about here. So why did it depend on all of those things? Well, to talk about that, I actually do have to go back to the 19th century and one of my favorite US historical characters of all time, not just for the amazing, amazing facial hair, but also because he was quite an interesting, kooky, problematic historical character. So this is Anthony Comstock. He basically led an anti-vice crusade to outlaw the distribution of information about contraception in the United States and contraceptive devices in the United States. He is the reason we had a federal Comstock Act in 1873 that prohibited the distribution of contraception information or devices in the US mail. And he's really the reason that US states pretty much all followed suit and enacted their own little Comstock laws that prohibited the distribution of information and or contraceptive devices within the states. So that was the case for decades until Margaret Sanger and women's rights advocates began a crusade to legalize access to abortion in the early 20th century. It culminates perhaps in a US Supreme Court decision in 1932 that struck down the federal Comstock law. It did not strike down individual US Comstock laws, but a lot of states began to invalidate them. They began to repeal them, and or state courts began to invalidate them. And so the situation in 1960, when the birth control was introduced, is that in some states, it was legal to prescribe it, and in other states, it wasn't. And there was a push to change that culminates in a 1965 US Supreme Court ruling in Griswold v. Connecticut that said married US women have a constitutional right to privacy that governs their ability to access contraception. And hey, states, you can't outlaw contraception for married women. The decision, though, did not say anything about unmarried women. And two states explicitly, Massachusetts and Wisconsin, explicitly amended their Comstock laws to say unmarried women can't consent, while other states continued to enforce the provisions that kept unmarried women from consenting. So there was this continued push, really led by an activist named Bill Baird, to extend the right to unmarried women. And that happened in the 1972 Supreme Court decision, Eisenstadt v. Baird, that extended that same right to young unmarried women. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening at the federal level, but there's also a lot happening at the state level, because up until 1972, actually really up until, 1976, there is this common law precedent in the US that says minors cannot consent to medical services. Like your 4-year-old cannot go to the doctor and ask for a flu vaccine and get it. You have to say they can have the flu vaccine as their parent. So that governed access to contraception also. So even as unmarried women were getting access, if they were minors, if they were legally below the age of majority, they still couldn't necessarily consent to it without a parent. So the age at which women were gaining access depended first of all on the state age of majority, which most states lowered from 21 to 18 in the early 70s, as well as state statutes that specifically governed minors' rights to consent to medical services, like I'm going to call these medical consent laws and mature minor doctrines. So there's this really complicated interplay of all of these state policies up until 1977, when in another Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court basically says, you know what, contraception is special. It's not like getting a flu shot. There's a special right to privacy here. And basically they say minors have a right to privacy in accessing contraception. And that's the basis of the policy coding that I present in the paper. So one of the tables in the paper says, okay, for each state, in what year did women who were age 21 and over first legally gain the right to access contraception? It's in 1960 when Enovit is introduced, if a state doesn't have a Comstock law, and it's later if they have a Comstock law that's getting overturned or invalidated. And then for women who are 18 to 20, when they gain the right to access depends on all of these laws. What's the age of majority? Is there a medical consent law? Is there a mature minor doctrine? Ditto for women under the age of 18. They never become adults, but they have all these other laws that are affecting them. And so the paper presents like a whole set of suggested coding that you can use if you want to estimate the power of the pill or control for the power of the pill. The paper also has a set of tables that tells you what other researchers used in their own coding and where there's a discrepancy, where I think it's coming from. And the paper has this detailed appendix that goes into a state-by-state basis. And y'all, I will really get into the details in this appendix. Like, I have old advertisements while I discuss Comstock laws and whether they were governing. And I'm like, was it really governing? I can find this advertisement. So there's a lot of historical fun in the appendix. And the second thing the paper does is really basically cover the same information for abortion. So abortion is governed by a fairly similar and related set of policies. Abortion was legal in the US until the mid-19th century. In the mid-19th century, it wasn't mostly Anthony Comstock, it was mostly the American Medical Association that led a drive to ban abortion, in part by portraying female midwives and female abortion providers as evil, damaging women. And bans were enacted in all states. Now, it doesn't mean abortion never happened. There was still all sorts of like coded advertising for abortion. Like, this is an ad suggesting to women they could douche with Lysol to cause an abortion and prevent calendar face. Like, it was still happening. By the way, that is not very effective and also incredibly dangerous. So it was still happening, but the laws were definitely governing access. So what happens after that era? Oops, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Oh, I did, sorry. What happens after that era in the 1960s is there's this real push to begin to liberalize abortion access and reduce those laws, or to repeal those laws. And so 13 states enact abortion reforms that make abortion legal under some circumstances, and 6 states repeal their restrictions altogether in advance of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which legalized abortion in the rest of the country. And so what the paper does is say, okay, we'll go through on a state-by-state basis, and we'll say, when was abortion legalized for women who are adults? And it's 1973 if Roe legalized it, and it's another year if they repealed their abortion prohibition before Roe. And then in what year could young women gain access? And what's really interesting here that the paper dives into is, in some states, it's like the same law that's giving an 18-year-old access to abortion and contraception. It's happening at the same time. And in other states, it's not. And the most critical difference, the most critical reason why it's not always the same law is that a lot of states had enacted very narrow medical consent laws designed to encourage prenatal care for young women who might not want to tell their parents they were pregnant, that said a pregnant minor can consent to any medical care related to her pregnancy. And they weren't thinking about abortion at all when they did it. But when abortion was legalized, those laws let them consent to abortion. So that was the case in the early 1970s, that basically young women could not consent to abortion absent an affirmative law. And then in 1977, the US Supreme Court had a decision that kind of reversed this and said, no, abortion is special and young women can consent to abortion absent a restrictive law. And they further refined that decision in Bellotti v. Baird in 1979, where they really clarified the provisions for valid state restrictions on minors' access to abortion. And I am running short on time, but I think I can get to the really key part. So I'm going to fast forward for just a minute, and apologies for that. No, I know what I'm going to do, sorry. So what the paper does is say, basically, it splits abortion consent into two periods. 1960 to 1976, when the default for minors is they can't consent absent an affirmative law. And then 1980 to present, when the default is a minor can consent absent a restrictive law. So why care? Why care about all this policy coding, which of course you can dive into in the paper? I'm going to give you a few reasons to care as I wrap up. I have some other papers that do run the regressions you might be wondering about, and they show a few things. First of all, when you correct previous errors in pill policy coding, the evidence that the pill mattered is at best substantially weakened. Also, if you fail to control for abortion access, you might conflate some of the powers of the pill with the powers of abortion. And in fact, while there's little evidence that the pill policies had a substantial effect, there is very strong evidence that abortion policies had a substantial effect, both in the 1960s and 1970s, and after 1980 to present. So these are all drawing on some other papers of mine, and the policy coding is being documented and detailed in the paper I'm presenting. So I'll end with my advice to you. If you are interested in using reproductive policy variation across US states as a natural experiment to implement, say, a difference in difference research design, my advice is to think carefully about the fact that policies governing young women's access are often different than policies governing adult women's access. And if you're interested in young women, you need to differentiate between the two. I would caution you also to keep in mind that the policy variation is not the same thing as technology variation. Just because abortion is not legal does not mean women, for instance, are not obtaining abortion. And you want to keep that in mind when you think about what the policies do and don't let you identify. I will mention briefly, you should consider how far away people live from states with liberal abortion policies, because travel could matter. And I would caution you, this is probably my most important caution for people out there. I see folks who want to estimate models that combine 1960 all the way to the present. Like they want to do 60 years of policy analysis. And my caution to you is that the late 70s is a very murky period in the US policy world, where it was quite unclear to what extent different state policies were valid or not. And my advice is not to use that 5-year period at all in an analysis. I do not think you should use it. And to analyze the 60s and 70s separate from the contemporary period because of these Supreme Court changes generating really substantial changes in the default common law practice. Okay, I will end there. And I'm super happy to take questions people might have.
It's a huge public service to the profession if you make all of this careful coding available. And so questions for Caitlin. If you can use the reactions to raise your hand. If not, I have a question while you all think about this and process that phenomenal amount of information. Do any states govern people from out of states access?
In the 60s, they did. In the 60s, some of the repeal states for abortion very specifically said out-of-state residents could not obtain abortions there. But it's not super important in practice because California, DC, and New York did allow out-of-state residents to obtain abortions in their borders, and they were the huge destinations. And the states that didn't were Alaska and Hawaii, and like nobody was going there anyway. So it doesn't matter in practice. I'm trying to think if there's any other situation where that's true. I believe the answer is no. I think it's just those specific repeal states where you see that ban. And otherwise, women could and did travel across state borders to access legal services.
Eva.
So given this, the travel issues, has anybody looked at the impact of kind of how it differentially impacts women from different socioeconomic and income levels, right? Because some people can afford to travel, and the women who might need it the most actually can't take the time off work or have the means to travel out of state.
Yeah, so in the contemporary era, I have a set of papers that don't use this policy variation, but rather use just variation in travel distance to providers. And they find that you're exactly right, and that the impacts of increased travel distance are much greater for poor women. In the 60s and 70s, I suspect that was very true also. I mean, anecdotally, you see it. Like, there were abortion flights from Detroit, Michigan to Buffalo, New York. They would charter planes, load them up with women, and for one price, fly them to Buffalo to get an abortion. They would feed them too. It was like all included, and fly them back. But it cost like, I'm trying to remember now, like $3,000 in current US dollars. So, I mean, I could afford that, but a poor woman absolutely would have an enormous amount of difficulty scraping together those kinds of resources. There is a little bit of research on travel distance in the 60s and 70s, but not much. Ted Joyce has a nice paper in the Journal of Health Economics. I have a really brief discussion of it in my JPE paper, but I think it's understudied, to be honest. Like, I think it'd be a really interesting place to go.
And my other question was why, especially the work that you showed that brings the pill estimates down and really links the gains to abortions, why isn't this getting more press these days when it's so crucial?
I mean, I would say it is. The power of the pill sounds great, and I'm not knocking contraception. I am a big proponent of access to reliable contraception and reproductive autonomy. And the power of the pill sounds really good, and it became a quick conventional wisdom. I'm not saying that pill technology didn't matter, but the foundation for the power of the pill literature, I believe, is shaky. But I think failures to replicate aren't super sexy. So people don't talk about it a ton. I don't know. I mean, people who work in the literature, I think, know, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Francisca?
Yes, hi. First of all, thanks for a super interesting presentation. So I have actually a working paper using your coding. And in contrast to many other settings, I'm not using admin or natality data because I'm not looking at a fertility related, but at a health outcome. So actually mental health. So I'm using survey data. And in light of that, I was wondering, because for these people, I know whether or not, or at actually which age they got married, whether I should incorporate that for the coding, because I would technically have information, like a little bit better information on whether they could have had access through marriage to the pill and to abortion.
So you're focused on the pill in the 1960s?
Yes.
Is it through an era? So abortion reforms begin in 1967. Is it through an era when abortion begins to become available also?
Yes.
So my first caution is I think it's going to be really important to control for both.
I do both,
kind of
yes.
Explicitly by putting abortion in there, or by splitting the time period, because the mental health effects of access to the pill might depend on whether women have the fail-safe of abortion available or not, right?
Exactly. So I have that always in, yes.
Yeah. So then with respect to whether you should consider marriage, I think the answer is yes. And unfortunately, it's a little bit murky, because basically what happens is Griswold makes it really, really clear that married women have a legal right to access contraception. What is not particularly clear is whether unmarried adult women were granted access by Griswold or not. Like Eisenstadt basically makes it clear that's true, but kind of de facto in the interim from 1965 to 1972, it was murky. Different things were kind of happening on the ground in different states. It depended on your provider. With the exception of Massachusetts and Wisconsin, where it was very clear because they changed their laws, and Wisconsin was actively prosecuting pharmacists for distributing condoms to unmarried adults. So like you can see it in a couple places, but I would certainly at the very least consider running any analysis separately because married women's access was so much more clear. But I would also consider that marriage is endogenous to access and that some women might have been getting married to gain access. I wish I had a simple answer.
No worries.
Right, fabulous. Thank you so much, Caitlin and everyone. And with that, I will now turn it over to our second paper, also about U.S. abortion policy by Grace Arnold.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I am Grace Arnold, and can everyone see my screen now? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the effect of regulations that target abortion providers on sort of abortion and births in the US. So real quick, I want to sort of get us all on the same page as to what a trap law is and what it is not. So these trap laws are, again, these are going to be restrictions that target abortion providers, and they largely fall into 3 categories. The first being abortion facility licensing requirements. So these are when abortion providers essentially need to have a license to operate, and this license may be contingent on things like the doorway and hallway widths, or the size of a procedure room. A second common type of trap law is one that requires the clinic to meet the same standards as an ambulatory surgical center. And our third type of trap law is a hospital admitting privilege. So this requires physicians to have admitting privileges. Sometimes it'll say like at a local hospital, at a hospital within 30 miles, but not every state will have that distance or time component to it. Furthermore, these trap laws are not mutually exclusive. So states can pass any combination of these laws like at the same time, or they might first have a licensing requirement and then a few years later add on a hospital admitting privileges requirement. So again, they're pretty broad, but in general, they're all targeting, the abortion provider, the clinic itself. So just to give you some real quick idea of how common these laws are and the sort of geographic variation in the passage of these laws, what I have here is just a map of the continental US. And when a state first passed its first trap law, again, you can see that it's pretty widely used across the US, particularly in the South and the Midwest here. And there's quite a bit of variation over time from before 1998 to present day 2014. So real quick, I want us to think about why these trap laws may impact abortion providers, and then how that might get passed along to patients, right? So these supply side restrictions, what they might do is increase the cost of providing an abortion, right? Kind of as I pointed out at the top, these laws may regulate like the actual facility. So the facility may need renovations. This could, in theory, get passed along to higher prices to patients, which might, again, reduce the quantity of abortions or result in delay of an abortion. It also might cause clinics to shut down if they cannot comply with the law. If that were to happen, we might see two things, which is one, some individuals may be further away from the abortion clinic. But also, even if my distance to my nearest abortion facility hasn't changed, my abortion facility may be serving a larger population now, so we may see increased congestion at the clinic. So again, all these things might result in changes in abortion or birth rates. Okay, so real quick, what I have here is just sort of a thought experiment for what might happen if like a trap law is passed and let's say clinics shut down. So the first thing that could happen is, okay, say the clinic nearest me shuts down. Well, if I'm able to travel to another clinic that's maybe a little bit further and get an abortion there, then I wouldn't expect to see a change in the abortion or birth rate in the state that passed the trap law, if we just have that interstate travel. A second option is there could be interstate travel, right? So if I live in Texas and Texas passes a trap law, I might be able to travel to New Orleans and Louisiana to obtain access. If that's occurring, what we might see is a decline in the abortion rates in the trap state, but no change in the birth rate in the trap state. But we would expect to see an increase in the abortion rate in the neighboring state, right? So abortions in Louisiana might go up, abortions in Texas might go down, but births in Texas wouldn't change in response to that. A third option is people may be just unable to obtain an abortion now. So that decline in abortion rates may translate to some sort of increase in the birth rate. And then my last 2 points here, I can't really distinguish in the data that I have, which I'll talk about in a second, but individuals might change their behavior, right? So if I know that it's harder to obtain an abortion, then risky behavior may decline some, contraceptive use may increase. And what that would look like in the data is it would look like the abortion rate's going down, but we might not expect to see a change in the birth rate in the trap state. And then similarly, if self-induced abortion or access to pills online were able to be obtained, we would see the abortion rate in the trap state going down, but we wouldn't expect to see a change in the birth rate in the trap state. Okay, so all of these sort of, again, kind of thought experiments are to say that this is what could happen. And obviously any combination of these things might happen. But what I'm going to sort of try to pick up on is the just aggregate effect. Okay, so real quick, right? Why might we care about this? So as you sort of saw earlier on with the map, there has been a rise in these trap laws over time and in recent years. And a couple trap laws in particular have gotten a lot of publicity. One you may or may not be familiar with is a trap law in Texas called the HB2 bill. So it was a bill passed in Texas that required abortion clinics to have doctors who have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles. And then a second part of that bill also required clinics to meet standards of the ambulatory surgical center. So after the admitting privileges requirement was passed, this led to approximately 50% of the clinics in Texas being shut down. And then subsequently, this trap law started making its way through the courts. And ultimately, it made its way up to the Supreme Court in the US. And in the 2016 ruling of Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt, the court ruled that this law was posed an undue burden and was unconstitutional. In their, I think I want to say amicus brief, but I risk getting legal terms incorrect. But in the Supreme Court's amicus brief, they also specifically mention that future courts should think about a balancing test when examining any sort of abortion policy, and that policies need to be thought about in terms of what is the potential benefit, the potential health or safety benefits of the policy, but that also you need to think about the cost or the burden that you may be placing on women by passing that policy. And there was also kind of a bit of talk at the time about relying on evidence-based research. So when this court case passed, many other states had laws that were similar to Texas laws. I think Wisconsin and Pennsylvania jumped to mind, and they had cases sort of being made up through the courts at the same time. And in particular, as recently as last year, I believe May of last year, the Supreme Court actually struck down a trap law in Louisiana that was similar to the Texas law, just relying on the rolling from the whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt. Okay, so what has the previous academic literature done in this space? While there is a substantial history on demand side abortion policy, there have been fewer studies that have explicitly studied the supply side abortion restrictions, but this field is also definitely growing. One of the main papers that studied Texas HB2, or one of the first ones, was this Grossman paper, which documented that approximately 50% of the abortion clinics shuttered after that first piece of the Texas HB2 bill was effective. And then following that, there have been a few papers that have used that variation in the travel distance to abortion providers to study the impact of changing distance or changing congestion on abortion and birth rates within Texas and its neighboring areas. So in this first paper, this Lindo 2019 paper, and actually, I think Myers is a co-author on this paper, so, feel free to jump in if I say something incorrect. But they document that increasing distance from 0 to 50 miles to 50 to 100 miles leads to a decline in the abortion rates of about 16%. And they are also, I believe, the first paper to look at the impact of clinic congestion, right? So some clinics may be serving a larger population now, and they actually find that that contributes to a decline, or some of the observed decline in the abortion rate is also because of that higher congestion. And then a second similar paper also used the variation in distance by HB2. They have I think 1 year additional data, but they find that having no clinic within 50 miles leads to an increase in birth rates to around 1.3 to 2.8%. Okay, so these papers are, again, largely looking at the impact on Texas. There's, again, another paper that looks at a trap law specifically in Wisconsin. So what's, kind of the contribution, or what's my specific research question? So I wanted to look at whether Texas was unique, to be honest. So when I started this research question, I lived in Louisiana, and I think almost probably anyone in the South can tell you that Texas is a funny creature, right? It's its own unique thing. It's a really massive state. And so I was curious if the effect of trap laws, because they are rather common, was generalizable, or whether you would see these effects in places that were not Texas. So I kind of wanted to zoom out and do this at a national level. And I also wanted to look at longer run effects of trap laws, right? So again, it could be that women's behavior change over time. And I wanted to examine whether or not those sort of immediate findings stay there over time. Okay, so as Caitlin detailed in great detail in our first presentation, sort of the difficulty in collecting laws and how difficult it is and how important it is. Something I got to do for my paper was attempt to collect the first year that a state passed a trap law. So this great paper by Jones and others in the American Journal of Public Health had actually identified all of the state statutes that could qualify as trap laws. And then from there, what I did was I used those state statutes to look up kind of the history of that statute using the Westlaw database. Again, there's a lot of laws, and I quickly realized that it was going to be beyond the scope of the paper for me to sort of classify every single law and identify when every law was passed and what type of law it was. So instead, what I did was identify the first time a law was implemented in a state. Then next up, I have just abortion and birth data that is from the CDC, sort of their annual abortion surveillance reports, or the vitality statistics. And then I pair that with population data, the SEER data sets commonly used in the US to get population data counts. Okay, so just real quick, what I'm going to show is just one equation, but my main identification strategy is, again, as Caitlin talked about in her previous one, going to be exploiting that variation, that policy variation by states and over time. And I'm going to show us just the generalizable, flexible difference in difference design. So I'll have here the log of my outcome variable. So this could be the abortion or the birth rate in state S at time period T. And then my coefficients of interest are going to be this pi y and phi y here, which are interactions between an indicator variable for whether or not the state is a trap state, and then another indicator variable for when I observe the observation. So, right, if the observation is observed 2 to 10 years prior to the adoption of the trap law, or 0 to 10 years after adoption of that first trap law. And then, have state fixed effects, year fixed effects, a vector of state level controls, etc. So of course, our main underlying assumption here is that absent of the trap policies, abortion or birth rates would have evolved similarly in trap and non-trap states. As I'm sure all practicing empirical economists here knows, this is an inherently untestable assumption, but having the inclusion of the leads in our model, those coefficients pi y, will let us look at whether abortion or birth rates were evolving similarly before the trap law is passed, but that after the trap law is passed, we will never observe that world of if the law hadn't been passed. I do also include region by year fixed effects in some specifications, just so that I'm comparing states within a region, in case you believe that Oregon is substantially different from Louisiana. And then just a few estimation notes here, which I won't necessarily get into. Okay, so real quick, my first graph here is just going to show us the effect of this trap law on abortion rates over time, again, approximately 10 years before the trap law was passed and up to 10 years post. And I think the main takeaway here is we see, again, our leads are all kind of bouncing around 0. So we don't see too much difference in the evolution of the abortion rate prior to the trap law. And then we do begin to see that reduction in the abortion rate after the trap law is passed. And it actually stays low for the 10 years that I have passed here. So if I were to summarize this with just my difference in difference results, we could see that the abortion rate falls about 11 to 14% in states after they pass trap laws. And to put this in some context, this is around 1.4 to 1.9 fewer abortions per 1,000 women. Next up, I think the natural next question is, do we see that impact on births? And then we can sort of try to tease out which one of those 5 hypotheses is sort of we're seeing on average. So here, the effect of trap laws on births. Again, this exact same setup, but now the outcome variable is the log of the birth rate. And we see that, again, prior to the trap law being passed, our coefficients do bounce around 0. We do see kind of a tick down in year -2, which is a little worrisome. And then after the trap law is passed, we begin seeing, an increase in the birth rate, which really levels off around year 3. And again, stays high. Again, kind of putting some numbers to what we just saw visually, that translates to roughly, depending on the specification, 1.3 to 3% more births, or 1 to 2 births per 1,000 women of childbearing age. To kind of compare that finding to the decline in the abortion rates that we observe, again, depending on your specification, but that increase in the birth rate accounts for roughly 70 to 80% of the decline in abortion rates. So a lot of that decline in the abortion rate that I saw earlier is translating to an increase in births. So real quick.
I don't want to interrupt, but I am going to, since we only have 4 minutes left in our hour now, I want to see if there are any questions before people have to move on with their day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if not, then, we can continue with it. Any questions before Grace continues?
Jump with that dip in birth rate that you saw right before the policy. Was there talk people would know? I would be thinking, if I know my state's going to pass a trap law and I want access to abortion, after that, maybe I would choose to terminate a pregnancy more likely, knowing that in the future I won't be able to.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if I could change. I wonder if there's a way to investigate that exact thing.
Yeah,
because
how early they start talking about it, that this is right in the discussion, that might affect women's behavior at that point already before it actually passed.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, yeah, that's an excellent point.
Caitlin?
Sorry, didn't hear you. Yeah, so I have 2 kind of related comments / questions, Grace. I think this is really cool. It's tough to categorize a trap law. Its enforcement isn't the same as a demand side restriction. And in particular, several of the large states with trap laws have consistently carved out exemptions for existing providers, although not for any new providers that might want to enter the market. It was true in Virginia and in Ohio.
Yes.
And so that's kind of one reason I would think you might in some ways see this might be an underestimate of the effect in the sense that a lot of the states have exemptions. And at the exact same time, I would mention in terms of anticipatory effects, what we also saw in a lot of states is providers closed before enforcement began, explicitly saying our lease is up, we don't want to renew because we know we can't afford to stay in practice. And so it impacted access before the enforcement date would be one explanation for what you're seeing.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point. And the point about like those grandfather clause that you mentioned, again, is also a very important point, because lots of states, I think probably made a little more clear in the paper, but lots of states, when they pass those trap laws, do explicitly say like abortion clinics that were operating before a certain date either don't have to comply with this law or may have so many years before they have to comply with this law. So yeah, that would also mean that we may not see as strong of an effect in those states. So there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity, again, depending on the type of law that was passed and the exemptions that may have been passed with that law.
Helps explain what sort of surprised me in reading the paper, that the effect appears to grow over time. So if it's that you're initially grandfathered in for a period of time, or if when you move facilities or expand facilities, then you have to comply with the law, that would help explain the growth.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
We're now at the hour. So I don't want to keep impinging on people's time, but we very much appreciate those of you who joined us. I need to paste a link in here to Grace's article as well, but we certainly invite all of you to continue the conversation with our authors, as well as to read the papers, of course, and to utilize Caitlin's wonderful data set. And we will all stay tuned for what happens with the Dobbs decision in the United States. And I'm sure that there will be many more papers to come, some in the Journal of Population Economics. So with that, thank you to all for joining us today, and especially to our authors. So Caitlin and Grace, but thank you very much for your papers and your presentations.
Thank you.
So thank you all also from my side, and see you soon at another event of the journal.